Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of our four-part series on rural post-secondary pathways, co-hosted by the Hunt Institute and the Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research. I'm AJ Jager, the W. Dallas Herring Professor of Community College Education at NC State and Executive Director of the Belk Center. The Belk Center serves North Carolina's community colleges by convening leaders, creating tools, and catalyzing change to help build stronger, more resilient communities across our state. The Hunt Institute and Belk Center partnered on a webinar series last year around adult and diverse learners, and we are thrilled to be collaborating again. This first session lays an important foundation for our series. We will touch on issues about how we define rural serving institutions, what's at stake for rural economies, and how this work plays out in an institution that serves a large and diverse region of rural America. In future sessions, we will explore strategies for enrollment and engagement of adult students, approaches to innovation in rural serving institutions, and much more. Today, we have four experts from across the country who will frame this conversation of post-secondary pathways in rural communities from a philanthropic perspective, policy perspective, economic perspective, and institutional leadership perspective. Dr. Keith Witham will serve as our moderator for today's session. Dr. Witham is the Vice President for Ascendium Education Philanthropy and previously served as Managing Director of the College Excellence Program at the Aspen Institute. Dr. Witham has a wealth of insight in his own experience identifying high-performing post-secondary institutions and leaders, and will guide our conversation. Keith, welcome, and thank you, our presenters and participants, for joining today.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Jager, and it's such an honor to be here with this great panel and with your audience, and really want to express first my appreciation to the Hunt Institute and to the Belk Center for setting up this really thoughtful webinar series and bringing together this excellent group of folks to help us understand what's at stake. So as you said, I'm Vice President of Education Philanthropy at Ascendium Education Group. If you're not familiar with Ascendium, Ascendium is the nation's largest federal student loan guarantor, the previously known as Great Lakes Higher Education Guarantee, which is more familiar to some folks, especially those of us who have had student loans from institutions in the Midwest. With our roots originally as the Wisconsin Higher Education Corporation, established to administer the federal guaranteed student loan program in Wisconsin after the Higher Education Act of 1965 established that program. Over the years, we've grown and acquired other states and parts of the country as a guarantor agency, and the net proceeds from our services as a federal contractor, as well as from our investments and other activities, are channeled into our national philanthropy, from which we now award over $100 million a year in grants to efforts that are intended to help low-income learners achieve upward economic mobility. When Ascendium transitioned from Great Lakes back in 2018 and 2019, the philanthropy really pivoted from being a regional funder focused largely on college access and success in the service region to a national funder focused on systemic change in support of transforming lives of learners from low-income backgrounds through post-secondary education or workforce training. In developing that new strategy as a national funder, Ascendium's board and the philanthropy staff identified rural learners along with incarcerated learners as a unique population and populations that had largely been neglected in many of the large national post-secondary reform movements that we're all familiar with, but that were also just so critical to our future as a nation. And so felt that Ascendium could have an outsized impact for those learners and made a commitment to having an explicit focus in our grant making on supporting rural learners. So far that focus for us as a funder has focused on several areas. It's focused on research to better understand rural learners and the institutions that serve them, including some work that you'll hear about in a minute. It's focused on supporting and evaluating innovative workforce training models to connect rural learners to good jobs without them having to leave their communities, which is very real to me as somebody who grew up in a rural community, that opportunities often, when you find them, pull you away from home. And we're very committed to not just creating pathways out of rural communities, but thinking about the good jobs that exist in rural places and how to connect the people who live there to them. And then finally, our third priority within our rural area is to focus on strengthening partnerships between those different entities in rural communities that really form the fabric of economic growth in rural places. So post-secondary providers, certainly, and we'll hear from a phenomenal one today, as well as workforce training agencies, workforce boards, employers, and other community-based organizations. I think one of the most promising trends for me that we see is the growing attention to rural learners and institutions. The urgency of demonstrating the value proposition of education beyond high school in rural communities is really greater than ever right now. I think as worryingly enrollment declines for many rural institutions is coinciding with just a continued growth in inequality, even as many good jobs in rural places are going unfilled. So that's a puzzle that we're working on, that I know some of my colleagues on this call are working on, and many of the audience, I'm sure, as well. That's why I'm so grateful to be joined by the three national experts we have here, and grateful to Hunt and to Belk for convening us and continuing to raise awareness and urgency on behalf of rural learners. So with that, let me turn to this great panel so that we can hear from them. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vanessa Sansone. Dr. Vanessa Sansone is Assistant Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She's also Director of Policy at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, or as we'll refer to them today, ARC. Dr. Sansone, thank you so much for being here today. Last year, ARC revealed a first of its kind metric to determine rurality that's thinking about the sort of the notion and characteristics of reality beyond just a location. And that tool, and as it's rolled out, has yielded some really interesting findings already and ways of thinking about who rural serving institutions are. For example, of the more than 1,000 rural serving institutions that were identified by ARC's metric and tool, a third of HBCUs in the country, 18% of high Hispanic enrolling institutions, meaning at least 25% Hispanic enrollment, 93% of tribal colleges and universities, and 94% of those that are high Native enrolling institutions beyond just TCUs are all rural serving. And that's a really, I think that was surprising to many folks, certainly to me, to understand just the vast diversity that exists within RSIs using this metric. I also found it especially noteworthy relative to our mission at Ascendium that 83% of post-secondary institutions located in low employment counties are RSIs by this tool, by this metric, and more than 2/3 of the institutions located in persistent poverty counties are also rural serving institutions. So I think already this is yielding some really, as I said, interesting ways of thinking about rural serving institutions, but I'd love to hear from you. Tell us about this metric, why ARC thought this was needed, what new insights you and the ARC team think it offers to the field, and how you hope it'll be used to better serve rural students.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction into this very important topic. And thank you to also the funding provided. My colleagues and I at ARC, some of us have connections in different ways to rural. Some of us research rural higher education. Some of us are from rural communities. Some of us teach in colleges that would be defined as a RSI, a high rural serving institution. And so our interest was really centered around this personal connection. But in engaging in the research, when we looked at to see when we talk about rural higher education, it often talks about students, which is very important. However, we were really interested in understanding about the unit of analysis being the college or university, who's actually serving these students or communities. And so through the generous funding from Ascendium Education Group, as well as Joyce Foundation, my colleagues and I set off on a way to operationalize rural serving institutions. So what's unique about this is that it truly centers all things rural that we can measure. I preface that because, one thing, it's not perfect, but we spent over a year with, the 5 brilliant minds that we are, really thinking intentionally about the serving component of a rural serving institution. So for example, we considered also our expertise. We're higher education scholars as well as demographers, political scientists. And we started to think about these measurements in terms of broader ways than we have before. We turned to federal classifications of minority serving, historically Black college universities, Hispanic serving institutions, which are often enrollment based. And we wanted to kind of learn the lessons that we've learned where there's been some things that have been problematic in terms of understanding those institutions collectively. So with our RSI metric, we take into consideration things that truly are rural. An example of that is one component of it, but not the only. But we thought about what are the degrees that are awarded to, in rural areas from, again, what we define as an RSI. One would think, and we pressed each other on this, well, education, health, which are very important to rural communities, particularly in the context of this moment. But when we started to really push each other on this, we couldn't say, for example, that those degrees awarded were truly rural serving, because urban centered, institutions also award those degrees. However, what we did find based on our analysis and review is that degrees that were truly, about these rural institutions were agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation. So that's an example of how this metric takes in consideration what is serving, what is actually rural serving. In addition to that, we wanted to push back on the notion that you had to be in a rural area to be a rural serving institution, because there are institutions who are serving rural communities that may not necessarily be located. So we incorporated those considerations into our metric. Based on that, we came out with an RSI metric score. The thing about the RSI metric is that it's a continuation, an index score. And so part of the reason we wanted to do that is because we didn't want to say that things were good or bad, you are or are not rural serving. Again, learning from some of the lessons of our federal classifications of institutions, because we have seen how that's been a little bit problematic. So we wanted to add more nuance into this. And so it is a continuation metric to where institutions can see where they lie. I wanted to mention, for example, give some examples of how this has been used. So given the context of the Belk Center, I thought, for example, it would be important for me to mention that based on our RSI metric, the two institutions with the highest RSI scores in the state of North Carolina are Elizabeth City State University and Chowan University. But also, given the community college focus, in looking at our RSI metric in the state of North Carolina, I see the two highest RSI community colleges are Tri-County Community College and Tri-County, sorry, that's the highest. Why this is important, though, is because it allows us to begin to tell a more nuanced story about the work that we're doing, that RSIs are doing. For example, I just mentioned Tri-County Community College with one of the highest RSI scores in the nation, not just in North Carolina. When I compare that, which I am able to do with this metric, to other institutions across the country, but even in state contexts, I can compare, for example, Central Carolina Community College, which also has a high RSI score. However, when I look at other measurements that we've included in our tool, which you are able to take a look in using that link that's in the chat box, I can see that Tri-County Community College has an endowment per FTE of $253. When I compare Central Carolina Community College, they have an endowment per FTE of $1,788. So the story, that you began to tell as a leader really has a more robust understanding with this RSI metric and RSI tool. At the end of the day, I do have to say that ARC is about uplifting regional and rural serving institutions. So that is a part of our mission, and we aim to do that at both institutional as well as state and federal, which we also have done that I can speak more to towards the end of our presentation.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, the notion of rural servingness and what really constitutes the contributions to rural America outside of just enrollment, which, as you said, has limitations in terms of our thinking comprehensively about the value that these institutions add, not just for their learners, but their communities, especially for regional four-year institutions and community colleges. I'm sure when we hear from Dr. Reese in a few minutes, that idea will be underscored, because I know that institution to be one that's deeply embedded in its community. So really, I think that underscoring the value of this tool and helping us think beyond enrollment to what really is that value add, and then how do we fund and support that value add appropriately. Thank you. We'll come back to that at the end for sure, but I want to move to Dr. Laura Dawson-Ulrich. Dr. Laura Ulrich is a senior regional economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in the 5th District, where her work focuses on higher education, in particular community college enrollment and outcomes, as well as school finance reform and economic development. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ulrich.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Sitting at the Federal Reserve Bank, where you and your colleagues, I imagine, are thinking a lot about economic development, unemployment, workforce participation, wage inequality and poverty. I'm curious, when you track the disparities in post-secondary attainment that were laid out sort of in the context for this webinar between more urban populations and rural populations, why is that worrisome for you, or why would that be top of mind for you? And maybe more broadly, talk to us a little bit about the relationship you see between post-secondary attainment and future workforce trends and economic development for rural communities.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Keith. First of all, I do want to just mention why the Federal Reserve cares about this in the first place. Most people focus on one side of our dual mandate, which is about interest rates and inflation, which is, of course, on everybody's mind right now. But the other side of our dual mandate from Congress is to work towards maximum employment. And so clearly there's a very strong world connection between education and trying to reach that maximum employment goal. And so I do spend a lot of my time in this space. And as I'm sure most everybody who's on this call knows, enrollment in higher ed overall is down. It's been declining really since about 2011. But this has been a very uneven situation, because many of the large flagships are doing very well. So a lot of us have seen recent stories in our states probably about large flagships having record freshman classes and things like that. But the regional publics and community colleges have seen larger declines in enrollment. And so one of the things that does concern me, or I find really interesting, is we are hearing frequently from community college partners in our district. And our district is the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And when we talk to community colleges in our district, we're hearing pretty much from everybody that there continues to be a shift from more traditional programs, associate's degree programs, to shorter term certificate and credential programs. And so based on our outreach, what we hear most often is associate degrees programs are down, transfer programs are down, but shorter term credentials are up and dual enrollment is up. So from a workforce point of view, this may not be a problem, right? I mean, these shorter term programs, people are getting credentials faster, they're entering the labor force faster. Maybe they're able to, hopefully they're able to move up in terms of income faster. But there's a major issue when it comes to the funding of community colleges, because what is happening is even for community colleges that are seeing modest increases in headcount, they're seeing declines in FTE enrollment, and most funding is driven by FTE enrollment. We believe that this is more of an issue at rural community colleges. We're actually right in the middle of a study on this right now, where we're looking at how this issue is impacting rural schools more than urban schools. And the other issue is, so there's the issue with funding on the institution side, but there's also the issue on funding on the student side, because if these programs are on the non-credit side, students aren't able to utilize, Pell Grant funds or federal loans. So while there might not be a workforce issue and it might be a positive thing for the workforce, kind of our models around how we fund community colleges and community college students aren't really in line with what we're seeing. On the economic, and let me just say before I move on from that we're especially interested in what happens with this given the expiration of HERF funds, because what we've seen is that schools have been able to not necessarily fully acknowledge their revenue loss from some of these enrollment declines because the HERF money was so extraordinary. But now that that's gone, or will be expiring in the next year. If people got extensions, there might be serious issues at some schools. On the economic development front, though, educational attainment matters. When companies are looking at where to locate or where to expand their current business, educational attainment is one of the first things they look at, right? They want to know, what is my labor force going to look like in this area? And where I'm located in the Charlotte area, there is just a slew of new economic development deals being announced constantly in North and South Carolina. Much of this is coming from advanced manufacturing firms, much of it in emerging technologies like electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. And these job announcements come with huge numbers of jobs, most of which require some sort of credential. These are high-tech manufacturing jobs, and you need some sort of credential. And so rural communities have to work really hard to address these educational attainment gaps and to present their communities as a place that is desirable for business. This can be really difficult for rural places, especially in communities that are struggling with issues like broadband or lack of things like hospitals, grocery stores. But I do think there exists a real opportunity right now for rural community colleges to kind of change the story. We have a new survey called the Richmond Fed Survey of Community College Outcomes. And one of the things we're looking at in that survey in detail is the serving of high school students at community colleges. And the rural community colleges in our district are serving a very large number of high school students. And so one of the things I think about pretty regularly right now is, could there be a shift in thinking around this, right? Around dual enrollment, instead of using dual enrollment primary as a transfer mechanism, which is really what it's used for now, right? To get students some credits while they're in high school so that then they can move on to a four-year school, to thinking of it primarily as a way to help high school students attain credentials. I think about my own son who's doing dual enrollment right now, who wants to be a doctor one day. How many 17-year-olds want to be a doctor and then end up not being a doctor? A lot, probably. But instead of just thinking about what gen eds could he take in the next 2 years, what if the thought process is, what credentials could serve him best to meet his goals? And so I think, since rural community colleges are so engaged with younger students, this is a real opportunity for them. And I think rural community colleges in particular need to find ways to leverage the populations they have that are growing. Because I think this shift from more traditional programs to shorter term programs and dual enrollment is going to continue.
I agree. I think it certainly is. And nationally, it's about 18% of community college students are dual enrolled in high school, and in some states, depending on state policy. In Texas, it's as much as 20%, up to 30% in other states. So I think
there are rural community colleges in our district where 50% of their enrolled students are high schoolers. Right. So large numbers.
It's large numbers, and you're absolutely right. It is the enrollment growth in many ways is through dual enrollment, and the opportunities, I think, to extend those bridges down, even as community colleges are working on guided pathways reforms and building real structures and thinking about what is that back end job to push those pathways down into high school so that students see those paths early on. Well, maybe our third panelist can give some more boots on the ground insight to this. Dr. Anton Reese, I'm delighted to see you, to have you with us. Yes. I'm a big fan of Dr. Reese. He's the president of West Kentucky Community and Technical College, which I should name has been a finalist for the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence 5 times by my count, and was named a finalist with distinction 3 of those times in 2011, 2015, and in 2021 under Dr. Reese's leadership. I've had the privilege of getting to talk with Dr. Reese and his leadership team and others throughout his institution on numerous occasions, and know, as I said, this institution to be one that is deeply a rural serving institution in its core and in its nature, one that's deeply embedded in its community, and very much attribute some of its success in that regard to Dr. Reese's leadership. So glad you could join us, Dr. Reese. Tell us a little about the communities served by West Kentucky Community and Technical College, and then what kinds of strategies the college has adopted to address the needs of as Dr. Jager said, a really diverse set of students in a large region world, that much of which is rural.
Well, first, great also seeing you, Keith. Thank you so much for your support. Feel very honored to be part of this incredible conversation with my colleagues, Dr. Laura and Dr. Vanessa, and certainly all at the Belk Institute. So I was struck, certainly as my colleagues spoke, So a picture came to mind first and foremost when we say the term rural. If I had to draw it, in some ways, I see like, Manhattan, Chicago, DC, as examples, and anything 30, 40 miles out could be defined as rural. In my case, Paducah is located 260 miles from the state capital in Frankfurt. I'm actually closer geographically to Illinois, 6 minutes, to Fulton, Tennessee, Northwest Tennessee. And we also have a portion that we share with Missouri. So very regional, but very rural. But 260 miles, 2 time zones. I'm in the central, most meetings are in the east, and yes, they start around 8 a.m. in the morning. So I like to use this term gap to define rural, right? I think there's a geographical component. The A is for access, the P is for population, and the other P is for politics. So in this region, because we are so far removed from the geographical, political, economical capital of our state, it adds yet another layer in terms of how we serve our students. So I have about 18 counties in this service area, and many of those are some of the poorest counties in Kentucky, Illinois, et cetera. And so it was very important for me, given this opportunity now heading into my 7th year as president, that I don't want to do the Field of Dreams analogy, that's the name of the school, build it and they'll come. They aren't coming. You got to meet people where they are. And so it's very important for me to have continuous outreach. And we began literally for the first 3 years, us laying the foundation, which we now do annually, where I wanted myself and my team, entire team, cabinet leaders, to meet in every county to have firsthand dialogues and discussions, remove the guesswork, and do 2 things. Certainly learn and listen to what the needs are in those respective areas, and to be able to provide the sort of workforce training, as Laura mentioned, certainly the certificates, diplomas, associates. And so we also provided in each county that we designated by name of county, that education designation. We shared with them the number of students that we have from that county, the workforce training that we provided, the number of people that we employ, because we really wanted to situate the college, right, from that perspective and bridging that gap. I think second, and as importantly, it was so important as I looked at the lay of the land regionally, that our off-campus locations, I wanted to cut, Fulton, for example, is 52 miles from Paducah. So we have 2 campus locations right around the 27-mile mark, where we continue to increase the amount of offerings to cut that physical distance in half. The other part is significant is also broadband access, because some of the very rural areas as we speak, there will be no signal. We keep hearing about the last mile. We really hope that as part of the infrastructure bill that we could really capitalize on that. But even the electronic access, broadband, et cetera, is a challenge. So we try to provide some mobile hotspot opportunities to provide access certainly to students. And then certainly, second, when I talk about the population, our region for the last 4 census have been declining in population, minus the immediate Paducah-McCracken area, which has grown by about 2,000. And so population decline in combination with brain drain, particularly for I call it the 20 to 40-year-olds or families, retaining them and keeping them in the area is directly linked to jobs, and the level of credentials that we could get them speed to work to remain competitive. So in a nutshell, as a college, try to be very vigilant, meeting our stakeholders where they are, certainly doing convening, like our now 6th annual Regional Educators Awards, bringing together all of our K-12 partners. We do an Oscar-style award ceremony recognizing education, the original business symposium, over 100 CEOs and business leaders, hearing from them firsthand the specific sort of skill sets that they need and they're looking for. We just don't listen, but we also act. So I think it is important for rural colleges in many ways. We have to be even more responsive to the clientele that is directly connected to the economic, educational, cultural growth, quite frankly, of the entire region.
And you've done a remarkable job, I think, and as you said, all community colleges exist of and as part of their communities. It's in the name. But some of those strategies you're describing, Dr. Reese, in terms of really being out and listening and understanding across a broad region what the employers care about, what the and what the community cares about, and what is going to be the value proposition for higher ed. As my former boss colleague Josh Weiner from Aspen has said, community colleges, especially right now, we're no longer in a scenario of competing with other institutions. All higher ed institutions are competing against non-consumption of higher ed. In other words, we have to demonstrate the value proposition of learning beyond high school, and especially in rural places, the trust and trust in institutions of higher ed, and the value proposition, as you said, that this will get me to a job, that if I go here, there will be something on the other end that is better than what I have now. That message has to be made clearly, and it has to be stood up with real results. I think that's what you're demonstrating in Paducah and for your region. I'm going to ask one more question. As a reminder to the audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You should see at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to populate that with your questions, and we'll get to those in a minute. I want to come back to the whole group and just round back around on this idea of defining rurality. And as you've heard, as you all know, this is probably the most frequent question we get asked at Ascendium in conversations about our rural work is, well, how do you define rural? And we've pointed to the many different federal classifications that exist and different ways of thinking about this. But ultimately, we've tried to say something before we had the ARC tool to point to, have said something like, ruralness. It's about this notion of rural serving and what really is adding value and bringing value to rural communities. So I want to circle back on this. Just why is defining rural important as a starting point? And what do you think, for each of you, from the places that you said as a scholar, an economic policy thinker, and an institutional leader, what do you hope or think policymakers and practitioners and others who might be in our audience today should hold in mind about what matters most about rurality for the sake of post-secondary outcomes? In other words, what really are the stakes, or what's most important about rurality as we think about improving post-secondary outcomes? So let me start with you, Dr. Reese. Maybe you can pick it up and we'll go in reverse order.
So what immediately leaps to mind, actually, Keith, is this. So I think about my geographic region, and I think about the term controlling the narrative. I think the narrative is important, and the narrative oftentimes, is certainly my friend at the Federal Reserve would admit, numbers matter. I got 18 counties, probably about 300,000 individuals, but there are probably about 30 cities with duplication, competing for the same site selectors, the same business opportunities, and trying to get the attention of those at the state level. So I think that one part of defining rurality is being able to speak with the synergy, if you will, of one voice, with the thought that the synergy between the education, economic, the community stakeholders, I think that's a real important part of defining rural, is as much as that identity regionally, as opposed to a specific area. I think that gets in the way, quite frankly, a lot of times with regards to progress. I think second, there is a continuous back and forth. As I mentioned, 260 miles plays out one way, because oftentimes jobs, these big economic opportunities are linked to what is decided oftentimes in our state capitals or in our larger cities. And so if you aren't physically present and have access to bring the rural reminder, hello, we actually are in Kentucky. I think, so I link all that back to the narrative. That's the only term I can think of. It's about rural areas creating synergy to have a louder voice with bigger numbers to be able to get access and the trimmings to state, federal grants and economic mobility.
Dr. Ulrich, that seems like a great segue to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with the things that Dr. Reese said, and numbers do matter. And one of the things we're working on in our survey project is kind of redefining the way we're looking at numbers. And so one of the things that is most important to us in that project is defining which community colleges in our district are urban and which are rural. And this question could not be more timely for us right now, because literally today I'm working on this. We as the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond used the U.S. Department of Agriculture's RUCC codes to define urban versus rural. But that doesn't work all that well for community colleges because of the service areas crossing multiple counties. And so we started out classifying community colleges based on where their primary campus was, but now we've dug in further and we're looking at the percentage of the population served by each community college. You know, what percentage of those schools or people served are in rural places. And so in North Carolina, for example, 5 schools that we would have classified as urban switch over to rural using this new definition. So I think the struggle for me as a researcher and an economist is I want there to be an exact answer to what is rural, and there's not. And so we have to kind of do the best we can to define it. I was very happy that the school that Vanessa brought up is having the highest score for them also has our highest score for being the most rural in North Carolina. So hearing things like that is reassuring, but it's not an exact science. And it does matter in that definition, right? Because as we go out and talk to policymakers or leaders within the community college space, there's a lot of urban community colleges based on our definition that consider themselves rural. And then there's very rural community colleges that say, oh no, that's not rural, right? That's quite urban. And so it's hard from a research standpoint, but also very important to try to get the definition right.
Right, which I think was very much the driver of ARC's work. Dr. Sansone, do you want to underscore anything about what you think the stakes are in terms of being able to define rurality?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, you know, having studied this for a while now, is understanding that yes, if you're unaware that most of how we identify rural in the US, particularly in terms of policy, does stem from the RUC codes, which is the Rural Urban Continuum codes. Digging in deeper about how that came to be, that is a national survey, you know, began by, but also still overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I think something that's important for me to highlight just right there is that that's USDA. That's not, you know, education based, right? And I speak as somebody who studies this, and my training is in demography. So, you know, we use RUC codes all the time in terms of identifying, you know, places. But when you try to translate that into policy, it gets really messy. Because the second thing that I want to bring to light in this conversation is that, particularly when you're dealing with federal policymakers, most federal policy with regards to post-secondary education is created with urban lenses in mind. And actually, you could even make that argument for K-12. Think, for example, of major policies like, you know, the No Child Left Behind Act. Although, yes, some overlaps, you know, can be across the US, but a lot of what they put into the particular policy was created with an urban centric mentality. That's why, you know, we're just now hearing about broadband issues. This was something that, you know, was not known for some reason, you know, and only really truly came to light due to the pandemic. These things were issues that were already there, but it just limelighted them much more significantly. So that's really important because with federal policymakers, because most of them come from urban places and or, again, urban centric frames, right? So this also considers our rural policymakers that have rural constituents. They're still, you know, thinking about this in urban centric ways. When you try to identify what is a rural serving, it's really hard for them to see the gray. And also policy is very much often framed in a black and white way of who is rural, who is not. And there's much more to it than that. That's where we try to play a role in the advocacy to try and educate policymakers to understand that it's much more than a 25%, you know, student enrollment from a rural area. The other thing too is why this is so significant and important. We really highlight the federal policy playing into it. For example, in the Higher Education Act, Part Q, there has been a past legislation that says that there are federal monies that can go to institutions serving rural communities. The problem, though, is that money has not been allocated for it because the problem federal policymakers have are identifying who is a rural serving institution. So there is no money allocated in Part Q at this point, but it is past legislation in the Higher Education Act. So that this is an example of how and why it's so important for the work that we're all doing, but in particular for the work that ARC is trying to do at a federal level. We're pushing for more of an understanding about who these institutions are and the contributions they make, not just to rural communities, but to our higher education landscape in the US as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. We think a lot about at Ascendium about the incredible opportunity of the federal investments in infrastructure and green jobs, in all of the sort of money that's flowing to the demand side into local transit departments, and where that workforce is going to come from, right? And how do we actually ensure that even with the really good intent of much of that policy to channel funds into localities where good jobs could be created, who's going to provide that training? And to the point earlier, if it's short-term training or it's online training that's to be accessible, what are the barriers to that? So in terms of broadband access, in terms of like transportation to get to a training program, like what are the set of barriers that exist in rural places that might not exist in urban places, to ensure that as those opportunities are built, they really truly are accessible and benefit the learners and adults and populations in rural places to be able to access those good jobs. Let's turn to the Q&A. There's some great questions here, and so we'll get to as many of them as we can. Keep them coming. Jeff asks, how are the credentials that matter determined? I'm not sure who exactly that was a question for, but it's a great question. How do you determine? I assume, Jeff, we're referring to sort of the point about deciding which credentials have value for rural students. Maybe Vanessa, this is a question for you, but how do you think about the credentials that matter? Any of you could answer this. Yeah, I mean, it's really related to our RSI metric. So it's not, it's a starting point to really developing this. But again, we considered what are degrees awarded using zip codes that mainly rural colleges were awarding. So again, the 3 areas that we came up with were agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation. Again, that doesn't mean that these institutions aren't offering other degrees or other credentials in other areas, but what are the ones that are really focused in the rural community and rural area and rural workforce? That's one component of several that go into our RSI metric. And I welcome you to take a look at the links that are provided about the RSI metric. We give way more detail about all the considerations and the components that play into how our RSI metric and how it came to be. Thanks. There's a question about how are you partnering with industry to create new technology programs, for example, AI, cloud computing, that kind of training opportunities. Dr. Reese, this might be a question for you if you have an example, or Dr. Ulrich, you might have seen examples of this too, but partnerships between training providers and employers or industry.
So we have 2 high-speed, fiber optic providers in our region as part of our outreach team, which is a combination of our VP of Workforce, our academic dean, and certainly myself, meeting with those CEOs and getting feedback directly from them, regarding their needs and what's trending within some of these high-tech areas in particular. That certainly helps for us to align with the credential and skill sets of our professors, who would then deliver whatever that needed expertise is. We just bring it up because we just hired a CIT instructor that a big part of their background actually involve artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Had to pay a lot more money, but through the partnership with CSI, we were able to afford to do it as an example of that. So oftentimes it is a combination of direct conversations, certainly with business leaders, business industry leaders. Sometimes through things like the Kentucky stats, the workforce economic development at the state level. They'll provide different professions trending in terms of supply and demand, which would include, some of these more innovative sort of things. And last but certainly not least, Kentucky was very fortunate to be one of the states that got this big thing with electric vehicles in the Elizabethtown area, which is going to involve a lot of high-tech expertise. So again, oftentimes the ways in which these economic development opportunities come together is a combination of research, data, need, and then align them with the college's curriculum and expertise that we have to offer.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we do see a lot of great examples of this, but I will say, and I was glad Dr. Reese brought up an example where a company was helping them. It sounded like providing some money maybe to pay faculty as well and to support that effort. I mean, a lot of these high-tech programs need specialized faculty that are very expensive and are hard to recruit to rural areas, right? And there may not be a lot of AI cloud computing people living in the rural areas to be recruited to teach. And so one of the things I think that's interesting is that I think it's really important to have very good communication with industry, because sometimes I think industry can feel like if you just start a program, people will come, they'll enroll, you can find somebody to teach, it's just getting the program started, when that's not really the case, right? There's also the issue with finding faculty. There's also the issue with maybe, not other barriers students have to coming to the program, like needing income support and things like that. And so educating companies in your area about what are those barriers that prevent students from taking, I mean, all these schools already have great programs, right? Why aren't more people taking advantage of them? Well, there are some answers, and really educating industry on those, I think is very important as well.
This relates to the next question, which is about the challenges to recruitment. Specifically, there's a question about recruiting K-12 teachers and thinking, I think, Dr. Ulrich, about your point about dual enrollment and the huge potential there, but given the constraints on even being able to recruit K-12 teachers to rural communities, curious if you or Dr. Reese, you have thoughts about remedies for that challenge.
Yeah, so go ahead, Dr. Reese.
I was going to quickly mention, so the Regional Educators Awards that I mentioned, we were bringing together about 330 educators to be recognized. One of the functions of that event, though, too, is offering scholarships in teaching related. So we are part of that direct recruitment. We're always looking at partnerships. Some of the bigger cities like Louisville, they have programs where they'll pay for individuals all the way through grad school. Then they'll have to come back to the city to pump money in. Certainly are some examples of ways in which we try to support K-12, but it is becoming more challenging, certainly with the backdrop and pushback, quite frankly, around K-12 education.
Yeah, and I think this is why you see in rural areas so much more dual enrollment as a percent of total enrollment, because to the person who asked the question's point, it is very difficult to recruit somebody that can teach AP Calculus or AP English at a rural high school. And so being able to divert students to the community college to get those sorts of classes is a solution both for the community college and for the K-12 system. I will say in South Carolina, the governor just put forward a program called SC Wins that provides up to $5,000 a year for students who enroll in certain high needs, high demand areas, and education is one of them. A lot of times in the past, these high demand scholarships have been more for kind of like high tech, new emerging technology, but early childhood education is one of them. And so actually, I just spoke to a community college yesterday that has a pretty large number of high school students already enrolled in an early childhood education program, with the state funding their education to try to encourage. And then they're doing kind of an apprenticeship, like you might think of in manufacturing, they're actually doing with the local school district, helping an after school program. So to me, that was a really innovative way to get students who might be interested in education, really, moving forward with it even before they hit college. I think it's going to take creative things like that to recruit K-12 teachers. This is going to continue to be difficult.
And I just wanted to add, Keith, that this is the exact example that we're talking about with regard to the importance of rural serving institutions. They are given back to rural communities in some kind of way, often innovative, but yet aren't, given the credit oftentimes or particularly valued financially in ways for doing this. So, it's a great question because it gets to the heart at what we're trying to do here, to demonstrate how rural serving institutions are critical to making sure rural communities are served in every which way.
I'll just add as well that we made an investment in Reach University, which is an accredited online provider that provides the sort of the last 2 years of a teacher training program, and partners specifically with the Nascendium investment is partnering specifically with rural community colleges to identify both paraprofessional staff in K-12 districts, so folks even bus drivers, but also paraeducators, teachers' aides, as well as community college students who are interested in careers in education, to provide a sort of an articulated back 2 years of a 4-year teacher training program so that they can stay in their communities, continue working in those paraeducation professionals and complete the credentials. And that's something we're really interested in how can we, again, bring some of that training that, so you don't, especially if you're in a rural area, again, like I was, where I grew up, that didn't have any teacher training programs. Even if I had wanted it, I would have had to gone away. And then the chances of coming back were slim to be able to provide that, bring that training in partnership with community colleges into the communities.
Quickly,
yeah, please.
I think also what seems to be gaining a lot of traction in terms of getting more people involved in K-12 particularly are individuals who may not have the teaching credentials, but they'll hire them in and then provide ways for them to gain those credentials, which also helps with minority recruiting as well too. So that seems to be a trend as well too, depending on our person's expertise, getting them into the classroom, which there's always a great debate, right, in terms of what it says about the profession, but I just want to add that.
Absolutely. This relates to a question that Dr. Bearclose put in the chat that I think is a really interesting one. And Dr. Ulrich, you might be well positioned to reflect on this from a regional standpoint. When I was at the convening of the rural community college, I'm blank on the name of this, the Appalachian Community Colleges of the Appalachian region earlier this summer there in North Carolina. And there was quite a lot of discussion there about the need to think regionally about what community colleges could provide. Again, because of some of these very specialized programs are very expensive to create, to staff, and may have very few students. How do we think regionally about the capacity to provide that kind of training program, but also really job growth in many ways is regional in areas like the Appalachian region. So Zach asks, how does regional collaboration across rural serving institutions maybe factor into future success and sustainability of them and meeting the needs of rural communities? Dr. Ulrich, do you have a perspective on that collaboration?
I think this is one of the things that's really hard with community colleges because of the service areas that in most states are very well defined, right? So it's been like, I'll stay in my county or my counties and you stay in yours. But we are seeing examples of communities that are kind of breaking out of that and realizing, hey, we can't all do the exact same programs and have duplication and all buy this $1 million machine. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think this is very, very important. I think it's important for schools that are in a regional space that let's say there is, I know in Eastern North Carolina, there's actually a program called STEM East that's going on right now where they've done this, where they've said, okay, this one community college is going to be the hub for aerospace technology. This other school is going to be the hub for agricultural science. And they're doing some teacher training at schools in a regional way. I think that makes a whole lot of sense just from a efficiency standpoint, right? And an economies of scale standpoint. So I think it is something that could really pay off for rural institutions. However, as somebody that worked in public higher ed for many years before being at the Federal Reserve, I also understand how difficult that can be. It's very difficult. It sounds a lot easier than it is in practice oftentimes.
Dr. Reese, would you?
I would add real quickly on that too, and this kind of ties together the regionalism. I like to think of regions without borders. Back in 2017, there was a huge state initiative where the state actually put multi-millions into the high wage, high demand fields. And so was able to convene 22 superintendents throughout the region, which is not easy, by the way. And we were successful in getting a $3.4 million grant. And the clear goal there was to upgrade the equipment through all of the area technology centers, career technical centers, because that was a challenge within itself, was the facilities, if you will, in K-12 were just in terrible shape. And so we were able to partner on that, to upgrade that as a collective, to get students better prepared and as they transition to us.
Good example. There's a question, I assume this is for you, Vanessa, about contributing to the definition for community college finance reform. I'm wondering if you're just broadly, if you've seen any input yet from your work, ARC's work on other federal policy.
And I'm reading that first part that's a Texas-based researcher. So I'm assuming that it's also related to the current state legislation that just got passed.
Okay.
That it had been 60 years since the finance formula for community college had been adjusted. So my understanding is that we were not necessarily. I don't know that our work had been looked at. I'm not aware. There's always that possibility, because one thing that I haven't made clear is that all the work that we do at ARC, including the research and the tools, are all publicly available. We are not holding on to them and saying work with us and pay a fee or any. No, it's public. It's all public and out there for you. So there is a possibility that legislators or advocacy organizations used our work and some of the framing, but we were not a part of that discussion, although I am aware of it given my context here in Texas. So I'm glad to hear that that was important in this last legislative session.
I do think, I think as we look at that, that funding model, which I think is very much probably a bellwether for other states who are revisiting the question of outcomes-based funding for community colleges and the push towards thinking about workforce outcomes. The kind of tool, it was certainly our intent in the investment in ARC that in that tool that kind of comparison that you were citing earlier, of being able to look at like what does the FTE funding look like between rural serving institutions and none, and others, that could really drive some thoughtful policy and adjusting around kinds of inputs and outputs that would be built into funding models. So even if you didn't directly inform that one, I think certainly the intent that at the state level, that tool really helps to shape that kind of thoughtful policy development.
And if I can add to Keith, we tested our metric for over a year before we went live with it. But one of the stakeholders that we tested with were college presidents. And we heard from college presidents time and time again that they needed comparison tools, that they needed to know who were their, who were the institutions, that did similar things. Because again, federal using urban centric a lot of time, although good, it wasn't getting at, the specific contributions and the characteristics that college leaders in rural areas and rural communities were having to address. I'm sure Dr. Reese can attest to that.
Well, two quick things with performance-based funding, certainly from a president's perspective, I think it works well when you actually put money into the performance-based funding. Different models. I was in Tennessee and Kentucky, very different. One. Two, oftentimes the metrics becomes more volume-based than student success outcomes-based. And often missing is the discrepancy with, again, with underserved, diverse minority populations as well. So I think that performance-based funding conceptually sounds good, tied to high wage, high demand, those sort of things. But the devil's in the details, I think comes back to the amount of funding. And then certainly for those of us within systems you end up, like in our case, where 16 colleges are almost competing with each other for limited funds. So I think that there's certainly opportunities and challenges associated with performance-based funding.
Well, luckily, this is just the first in a series of discussions that the Hunt Institute and Belk Center will be convening. So much more time, hopefully, to grapple with some of these really important questions. I think this has been a fantastic conversation to kind of lay the groundwork, lay out the stakes for this conversation around rural institutions. Want to thank the panel for joining us, for the really thoughtful insights, for all of your work ongoing in each of your roles. Before closing, I want to just highlight that the Hunt Institute, my colleagues there, are sharing links to their upcoming webinars on empowering rural communities for higher education success on December 5th. And I want to thank you, all of you who are here, for joining us today, and hope to see you at the next of these sessions. Thanks again to the panelists. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Great. Take care, everyone.